They hid my wheelchair before dinner, whispering, "Crawl if you want to eat." That sentence, that venom disguised as a joke, struck me like a slap across the face, and it has echoed inside me for years because it was not the cruelty of strangers in some hostile street, but the voices of my own family in the house where I had been made to believe I was safe. I am 82 now, and I live alone in a modest apartment with walls thin enough that I can hear my neighbor's television at night and the sound of children running in the hallway in the morning. And although loneliness presses on me at times, I cherish the silence because it is mine, and it does not conceal knives behind smiles. I eat when I want and I sit where I choose. And if I move slowly, at least the pace is dictated by my own bones and not by the impatient sigh of a son or the sharp tongue of a daughter-in-law. But back then, I was not yet free. Back then, I was living under their roof, told I was lucky to be there, told I should be grateful for the food they placed in front of me, told in subtle and not so subtle ways that my existence was conditional, dependent on my obedience, my silence, and my willingness to shrink into the corners like a piece of furniture that had outlived its purpose, yet was too heavy to throw away without fuss. When I first moved in with them, it was supposed to be temporary, a few months after my fall, just until I got strong enough to manage on my own again. But months turned into years because independence kept being postponed by the little sabotages of circumstance and the heavy weight of persuasion. My son, who once as a boy clung to my skirts and begged me not to leave him alone in the dark, began to talk to me as if I were the child and he the parent, his tone full of exaggerated patience, clipped instructions, a voice that had forgotten warmth. His wife carried her disdain openly, never calling me by name, always she, as if I were not a person but a task, an obligation, a shadow cast over her dinner parties. They said I was better off with them because I would not be safe alone, because the neighborhood where I had lived for 40 years was too dangerous for an old woman, because what if I fell again, because what if the bills confused me, because what if I left the stove on. Each because sounded like concern, but behind it was possession, and behind possession was control. I should have seen it sooner, but people who survive decades of compromise learn to tell themselves stories in order to keep breathing. I told myself they meant well, that modern life had hardened them, that stress spoke for them, that tomorrow they would remember tenderness. I told myself these things because the alternative was too painful, that they had grown to see me not as mother or grandmother, but as burden, obstacle, weight. And then came that evening, the smell of roasted chicken drifting through the house, the clatter of plates set on a table that had once been mine, purchased with the wages I earned as a nurse working double shifts. I wheeled myself out of my room when I heard the call to dinner, but the chair was not where I left it. I searched the hallway, the living room, the small alcove where sometimes they shoved it when guests came over, and it was gone. I stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame for balance, hearing laughter in the dining room, their voices mingling with the music playing softly from the speaker, and then a whisper, sharp enough to cut through the air, "Crawl if you want to eat." The cruelty of the words was matched only by the casualness with which they were spoken, as if they were merely describing the natural order of things, as if this humiliation was as ordinary as passing the salt. I remember the heat rising in my face, the way my body stiffened, the sudden rush of blood in my ears. I remember thinking for a brief moment that perhaps I had misheard, that perhaps the voices had not been directed at me, but the laughter that followed erased all doubt. They wanted me small. They wanted me ashamed. They wanted me to surrender even the dignity of uprightness. That was the moment something broke inside me. Not loudly, not with rage, but silently, like a fracture in ice that spreads unseen until one day the whole surface gives way. I retreated to my room without a word, closing the door slowly so they would not hear the tremor in my hands. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the blank wall, and I thought of the years I had spent teaching my son to walk, his tiny hands gripping my fingers, his legs wobbling, his face bright with triumph when he took a few steps on his own. I thought of the countless dinners I had prepared, the nights I stayed awake sewing costumes for school plays, the mornings I rose before dawn to iron his shirt so he would look neat among his classmates. I thought of the promises I made to myself as a young mother, that no matter how little we had, my child would never feel abandoned, never feel less than, never feel unwanted. And now here I was, in my twilight years, listening to the echo of his silence while his wife sharpened her cruelty into weapons that cut me without leaving visible scars. It is difficult to explain what it does to a person to be told, in words or in gestures, that her right to sit at the table depends on her capacity to humiliate herself. It hollows you. It whispers that perhaps they are right, perhaps you are too much trouble, perhaps you are indeed just an old woman clinging to scraps of relevance. But there was another voice inside me, quieter but stubborn, the same voice that had carried me through night shifts at the hospital, through the years after my husband died, through the long hours of solitude when all I had were unpaid bills and a hungry child. That voice did not roar. It simply said, "No, not yet aloud, not yet to them." But inside me, it was steady. So I endured those evenings, and I endured the whispers, and I endured the erasure of my chair and the dismissal of my needs. But endurance is not the same as defeat. Endurance, when it thickens and hardens, becomes something else entirely. It becomes the soil in which rebellion grows, even if slowly. I tell you this now, not because I am proud of my silence in that moment, but because silence was my disguise while I gathered the fragments of myself that they had tried to scatter. I tell you this because every story of betrayal begins with a moment like that, a line spoken carelessly, but remembered forever, a line that reveals more than years of polite conversation. They thought they had reduced me to knees and elbows, to a crawl, but what they did instead was plant the seed of my uprising. And so this is where my story begins, not with birth or marriage or the chapters that most people think define a woman's life, but with a sentence hissed at me over dinner. That sentence was the map of everything that followed, the wound and the compass, the scar and the weapon. Today, when I sit by my window and sip my tea, when I hear my neighbor's laughter or the children's feet on the stairs, I remember that night not with bitterness, but with clarity. They thought they had silenced me, but in truth they gave me my first real words. They thought they had hidden my chair, but what they hid instead was their own humanity. They thought they had left me crawling, but what they did was force me to stand. And when I finally stood, I did so not only on my own feet, but on the mountain of every indignity they had ever piled on me. That is why I speak now, and that is why I begin with that sentence, because it was both the moment I was broken and the moment I began to be remade. The defining betrayal came a week after that whispered command to crawl, though of course, betrayals rarely arrive as single strikes, but more often as accumulations of small cruelties, until one day the pattern reveals itself in such a stark form that denial becomes impossible. And for me, that day was the evening I learned that my son and his wife had not merely hidden my wheelchair for their convenience, but had begun to plan a life in which my very existence would be erased, and the realization did not arrive through confrontation or confession, but through the slip of a careless word, overheard at the wrong moment, or perhaps at the right moment, because truth has a way of leaking when arrogance grows too sure of itself. I had wheeled myself, or rather dragged myself, into the hallway that evening because I heard the front door open and close, and thought perhaps it was my granddaughter coming home from school. And even though she rarely spoke more than a handful of words to me, I still held out hope that perhaps she might pause long enough to ask about my day. But instead, it was my son on the phone, his voice low and clipped, as he stood near the kitchen, and I stopped in the shadow of the doorway. Not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because something in his tone froze me in place. He was saying, "Yes, I think guardianship is the best option. She's not managing. She forgets things. And it would streamline the process for the pension and the property, and then silence, then the sound of him agreeing again, murmuring words of compliance, and the voice on the other end must have been his wife, because when he turned his head slightly, I caught the edge of his expression, the small frown of a man who has already decided something unpleasant but necessary, and in that instant, I realized they were not merely tired of me but preparing to seize me as one seizes an asset, a form to be filed, a signature to be coerced, a body to be contained under the banner of concern. I remember the taste in my mouth as metallic, as though I had bitten my own tongue, though I had not, and the room seemed to tilt for a moment, the light overhead buzzing faintly, the ordinary sound of a refrigerator motor suddenly roaring like machinery in a factory, and I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. They were speaking not of my well-being, but of my worth measured in currency, in pensions, in titles, in the square footage of a house that I had once helped them purchase by co-signing a loan when banks doubted their credit. And it struck me that all the hours I had worked in hospitals, all the patients I had bathed, all the long nights I had endured with swollen feet and aching back, all the money I had put aside for what I thought would be a modest but independent old age, had turned not into security but into bait for the trap my own family was setting. I returned quietly to my room, careful not to let the wheels of the chair squeak against the floor, though later I discovered they had hidden it again, perhaps to prove their point, or perhaps to remind me of my fragility, and I sat on the bed with my hands clasped together so tightly that the veins rose like ropes, and I listened to them moving in the kitchen, the clatter of cutlery, the laughter of people who believed themselves righteous, and I felt something shift inside me. It was not anger exactly, though anger came later, but something colder, sharper, more enduring, a clarity, as if a film had been stripped from my eyes, and I could see at last the architecture of the cage they were building around me. That night, I did not sleep, not because of fear, but because I was making lists in my head, lists of what I still had that was mine, what documents, what numbers, what small reservoirs of strength. I remembered the envelope in my purse where I had kept, for no clear reason, the business card of a lawyer I had once met at a church fundraiser, a man who spoke about the rights of the elderly, about how financial abuse often wore the mask of filial duty. I had slipped the card into my wallet that day thinking I would never need it, but something in me, some cautious instinct, had refused to throw it away, and now I knew why. The next morning, when the house was empty and the air still smelled faintly of the perfume my daughter-in-law wore, sharp and synthetic like flowers forced to bloom out of season, I pulled the card from my wallet and stared at the numbers, memorizing them before tucking it back, because I did not yet dare to call, not while they were near enough to overhear. Instead, I stood slowly, using the edge of the dresser for balance, my knees trembling, and I took a single step, then another, the muscles burning, the joints complaining, but I kept going until I reached the chair by the window. It was not much, just a handful of steps, but it was the beginning of something, the rehearsal for a future where I would stand on my own, however unsteady. The betrayal was no longer just the disappearance of a chair or the command to crawl. It was the conspiracy I had overheard, the plan to strip me not only of mobility, but of voice, of choice, of legal selfhood. It was the understanding that I was no longer regarded as a mother or grandmother, but as an object to be managed, a signature to be harvested, a problem to be solved through paperwork and signatures in court. And yet in the hollow of that knowledge, in the echo of that casual cruelty, I found something I had not expected: resolve. Because once you know the truth, you cannot unknow it. And once you have heard your name spoken, not as a person but as a case file, something in you either breaks forever or hardens into resistance. And I discovered, late in life, that I was not so fragile as they believed. So the catalyst was not only the whisper to crawl, not only the missing wheelchair, but the realization that my own flesh and blood were preparing to erase me while still keeping my body alive for their convenience. That was the night my story truly turned, because from then on, everything I did, every word I spoke or withheld, every step I practiced in secret, was shaped by the knowledge that I was in a fight not merely for dignity, but for survival as myself. And survival, I had learned long ago in hospital wards and in nights of widowhood, is not granted by kindness but claimed by will. And I would claim mine. The quiet worsening began so gradually that to an outsider it might have looked like nothing at all, just the slow erosion of small courtesies. But for me it was like watching the shoreline of a life I had once recognized being pulled away grain by grain, until one day I could not tell where the land ended, and the sea of diminishment began. And in those days after overhearing their plans, the air in the house seemed heavier, the walls closer, as though they too had conspired to remind me that I was not wanted in the light of their family life, but relegated to the dim corners where inconvenience could be hidden. They no longer left my wheelchair near my door. Instead, they folded it and shoved it into the closet under the stairs, and when I asked about it, my daughter-in-law smiled thinly and said that keeping it there was safer because otherwise guests might trip. And though her words were coated with a veneer of practicality, I felt the sting of her real intention, which was not to protect the guests, but to erase the sight of me, to erase the proof that in this house lived a body that did not conform to her curated world. Dinner invitations became irregular, sometimes my son forgetting altogether to call me from my room until plates had already been cleared, and on those nights he would appear at my door with a plastic container scraped with leftovers, placing it on my nightstand with the muttered assurance that he had saved me something, though the food was always cold, sometimes half-eaten, and I felt as if I were being fed not out of care but out of obligation, the way one tosses scraps to a dog that will not be let near the table. My granddaughter began to mimic her mother's tone, rolling her eyes when I asked about her day, whispering to her brother in that high conspiratorial pitch that children use when they know they have the protection of the adults, and I would hear my name followed by a suppressed giggle, as though I had become a character in a cruel game whose rules excluded me. Control seeped into everything, disguised as kindness. The house keys I once kept in my purse were quietly removed, my daughter-in-law explaining that it was safer because I might lose them or lock myself out. And though I wanted to protest that I had kept keys for decades without incident, I said nothing, only nodded while inside I felt another strand of my independence snipped. My phone, which once rang with the calls of old friends, stopped working properly because the ringer had been turned off, she said, to protect me from scams, and when I asked about the sudden silence, she said it was better this way, less confusing. And I knew then that I was being cut off from the world outside these walls. Even my medication was rationed with condescending precision. She placed my pills into a plastic organizer, counting them aloud as if I were a child who might swallow them for candy, and when I tried to explain that I knew my own routine, she smiled with that cold patience and told me it was for my own good. Everywhere I turned, I encountered these small humiliations, each one easy to dismiss if taken alone, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to mistake. They were training me, slowly, to doubt myself, to question my memory, to believe that I could no longer manage ordinary life. Gaslighting, the word I had once heard on television but never thought would apply to me, began to describe my days. I would say that my wheelchair had been beside my bed, and they would insist it had always been in the closet. I would recall conversation with my son, and he would claim it had never taken place. I would mention that the refrigerator had been empty of milk, and my daughter-in-law would laugh and hold up the full carton, as though I had dreamed my own hunger. The isolation deepened. They stopped taking me to church on Sundays, explaining that the trip was too tiring for me, though I knew the real reason was that I had once confided in the pastor about my loneliness, and news like that spreads. and they did not want their image tarnished by whispers of neglect. Neighbors who had once dropped by were quietly discouraged. I overheard my daughter-in-law telling one woman at the mailbox that I tired easily and preferred not to be disturbed, and so the visits ceased, and with them the last strands of connection to a community that had once held me. My world shrank to the dimensions of my room, 4 walls decorated with nothing of my choosing, a bed too soft for my back, and a single window that looked out not onto the street but onto the side wall of the house next door. I began to practice standing at night, when the house was quiet, using the back of a chair for balance, lifting myself slowly from the mattress, knees trembling, heart pounding, and holding upright for as long as I could. It was my secret rebellion, my silent preparation. They thought they were reducing me to a crawl, but in those moments I was relearning what it meant to stand, even if only for a few breaths. I counted those breaths as victories, each one proof that I was not entirely what they believed. Once when the lights went out in a storm, they left me in my room without checking if I had candles or a flashlight, and I understood then how little they cared for my comfort, how much they wanted me to feel helpless. But in the dark, I found a strange confidence, because I knew the contours of my room better than they did, and I moved slowly, touching familiar surfaces, feeling my way with the steadiness of memory, and I realized that helplessness is sometimes an illusion imposed by others who need you weak in order to feel strong. The escalation was not a single explosion but a long suffocation, each day pressing tighter around me, each gesture of false concern stealing another inch of my autonomy. Yet inside me, under the weight of their contempt, something else was forming. Not despair, but resistance, the slow gathering of strength that comes when you realize that you are in a battle not for comfort, but for the right to exist as yourself. And though the days blurred with loneliness, and the nights rang with the echo of their laughter at tables where I was not welcome, I held on to that quiet rebellion, that nightly standing, that whispered no inside my chest, because I knew even then that this quiet cruelty was not the end of my story, but the sharpening of the knife I would one day use to cut myself free. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly, as though it were not a decision at all, but a gradual turning of the soil beneath my feet. A movement so subtle that I only recognized it in hindsight, and it began on an afternoon when the house was empty. And the silence felt less like abandonment and more like opportunity. They had gone to a gathering at the daughter-in-law's sister's place, taking the children with them, and I was left alone with a bowl of soup that had cooled before it reached my lips. The clock ticked in the hallway, steady and unhurried, and for the first time in weeks I felt no eyes on me, no voice correcting me, no footsteps hovering like guards outside a cell. I stood from the bed and reached for the dresser, pulling myself upright with more determination than grace, and then I did something that felt both reckless and necessary. I took a step without holding on to anything. My knees wobbled, my breath caught, but I remained standing, and the rush of blood in my ears sounded like applause from a crowd only I could hear. It lasted only seconds before I lowered myself back into the chair, but in those seconds, I felt something I had not felt in months. Freedom, fragile but undeniable. That taste of freedom became a hunger. I began to practice each night when the house was dark, pacing the width of the room by gripping the wall, counting the steps, whispering encouragement to myself like a nurse tending a patient. I imagined I was my own patient, stubborn and scared, but capable of more than she believed. My body complained, my joints flared with pain, yet with each attempt I discovered reserves I thought had long since dried up. And with each night of practice, my confidence grew not only in my legs but in my mind, for standing even briefly on my own feet became a metaphor for standing against them, for standing against the suffocating narrative they had written for me. The true shift, though, came not from my body, but from a piece of paper, a remnant of a life they did not control. While searching through my old handbag one afternoon, I found the card I had tucked away years ago, the business card of a lawyer who had once spoken at a church luncheon about protecting the elderly from financial exploitation. I remember keeping it without much thought, slipping it into my wallet out of habit more than foresight. But when I held it in my hands now, the edges worn soft, it felt like a lifeline stretched across time. I stared at the name, the embossed numbers, the small promise of a world beyond the walls of this house. And for the first time, I thought not only of escape, but of defense, of reclaiming not just my legs, but my life. I did not call right away. Fear gnawed at me. Fear of being overheard. Fear of being dismissed. Fear of discovering that I was indeed too late to protect myself. But the idea had lodged inside me, and once planted, it could not be uprooted. I began to plan in small ways, hiding coins from the grocery change they occasionally allowed me to handle, tucking away bus schedules left in the mailbox, rehearsing in my head what I might say if I could reach that lawyer. My mind, dulled by months of humiliation, sparked alive again with strategies, with possibilities, with hope disguised as logistics. What made the shift undeniable, though, was the day I overheard them once more. They were in the kitchen with the door half closed, speaking in low voices about selling my old house, the one that had stood empty since my move into their guest room. My son's voice was hesitant but pliant. My daughter-in-law's sharp with impatience as she said it made no sense to let the place sit when the money could be used better. Better, of course, meant for them. My name was not mentioned as though the house were theirs by right already. I stood in the hallway listening, the floor cold under my bare feet, and instead of despair I felt a surge of steel through my spine. They might see me as diminished, but I still knew the truth. My name was on those deeds. My signature still mattered. My will was still my own. That night, when the house was finally quiet, I wrote down on a scrap of paper every detail I remembered about that property: address, year of purchase, bank information, so that I would not forget. It was my proof, my anchor, my reminder that their control was built on illusion. The midpoint of my journey was not marked by triumph, not by confrontation or victory, but by the inward tilt of a compass, a realization that I was no longer simply surviving their neglect, but beginning to prepare for something else. I no longer measured my days by the size of their cruelties, but by the small steps I took in secret. A few feet walked without the chair, a line of numbers memorized, a card hidden under the mattress. Each act was a rebellion, each gesture a seed. I knew then that the story would not end with me silenced or erased, because I had begun, quietly and stubbornly, to rewrite it. The past has a way of pressing itself back into the present with a persistence that feels almost vindictive, as if it cannot tolerate being ignored. And after the fragile beginnings of my secret strength, after the nights of practicing steps and the silent memorization of numbers, the walls of their house began to lean inward again with renewed pressure, reminding me that they had not relinquished their hold, that my small rebellions had not gone unnoticed, and that the war for my autonomy was only just beginning. It started with questions disguised as concern. My son appearing in the doorway of my room with his arms folded, asking if I had been on the phone lately, his tone casual, but his eyes narrow, scanning the room as though expecting to find contraband. I told him no, and in a technical sense, it was true because I had not yet dialed the number on that lawyer's card. But my hesitation must have betrayed me because he lingered, his gaze catching on the purse at my bedside, and he said, almost two, softly, that sometimes older people got confused and gave out information to strangers, and that could be dangerous. His wife followed later with a similar speech, framed not as accusation but as reassurance, telling me she had read an article about seniors being manipulated into giving away their savings, her voice syrupy and false, and I knew these were not warnings but preemptive defenses, lines rehearsed for the day they might claim that anything I signed or said was the result of confusion, not choice. The pressure thickened when they began to manage even my silences. One evening, after dinner had been finished without my presence, I found my chair missing once more. And when I asked about it, my daughter-in-law's lips curled into a thin smile as she said it had been taken for repair, though I had never seen a repairman in the house. I realized then that they wanted me not only physically still but psychologically stilled, deprived of even the illusion of mobility, so that when the time came to march me into court as evidence of their guardianship claim, I would appear as diminished as they had painted me. I was expected to perform helplessness, to play the role they had written, and every withheld chair, every locked door, every rationed pill was rehearsal for that performance. The most brutal night came when they deliberately left me in darkness. A storm had knocked out the power, and I sat in my room waiting for them to bring a candle or a flashlight, but none came. Through the crack of the door, I saw the flicker of light in the dining room where they sat together, their own needs met, their comfort assured, while I remained cloaked in shadow. At first I felt panic rising, the old fear of helplessness tightening around my chest. But then I realized that I knew the room better than they did, that my body remembered the geography of the space even when sight was taken away. And slowly I stood, bracing against the wall, and began to walk. Step by step I moved in the dark, my palms grazing the familiar surfaces, the bedpost, the dresser, the chair back, until I reached the window, and there I stood, upright and steady, the storm outside raging, but the storm inside me quiet, and I understood that what they had meant as punishment had become proof of my resilience. When they finally returned, pretending to check on me with theatrical concern, I was already seated again, calm, my face a mask that hid the small flame burning within. But even as I gained strength in secret, their tactics escalated. I discovered one morning that some of my documents were missing from the drawer where I had kept them. My old bank statements, the copy of the deed to the house I still legally owned, small scraps of paper with account numbers. When I asked about them, my son shrugged, said perhaps I had misplaced them, and I felt the sting of their strategy, which was not only to take but to convince me that I had lost, that my memory was failing, that my grip on reality was slipping. They wanted the court to see me as unstable, unreliable, incapable. I sat on my bed after he left, my hands trembling not from age but from fury, and I promised myself that whatever else they stripped away, I would not let them strip away my clarity. The second escalation reached its peak the day they raised their voices. Until then, their cruelty had been quiet, disguised under manners, but that day it burst through. I had asked cautiously if I might go to church again, if only to sit in the back pew, and my daughter-in-law snapped, her voice sharp, saying that I was ungrateful, that after everything they did for me, I still wanted more, that I should be thankful I was not in some facility where no one would care whether I came to dinner or not. My son stood behind her, silent as always, his silence the heaviest weight in the room, and I looked at him, searching for some flicker of the boy I had raised, the boy who once held my hand so tightly crossing the street. But there was nothing in, his face but a blank fatigue, as though compassion had been emptied from him long ago. It was in that moment, hearing her spit the word facility like a threat, that I understood they were testing me, pressing me harder to see if I would crack, to see if I would collapse into the role they had designed. I did not collapse. Instead, that night, while they slept, I opened the drawer where I kept the lawyer's card, and I dialed the number from memory on the old cordless phone I had hidden under my bed. My voice shook as I spoke, telling the secretary who I was, asking for an appointment, whispering because the walls felt alive with ears. But I did it, and when I hung up, I sat for a long time in the dark, my hands pressed together like in prayer. The appointment was set for the following week, and I knew I would need strength to reach it, but I also knew I could no longer delay. The past had come roaring into the present, threatening to erase me, but in answering that call, I had turned the tide. In the days that followed, the pressure did not lessen. They grew suspicious of my silences, suspicious of the way I looked at them, suspicious of the faint steadiness returning to my walk. My daughter-in-law muttered about paranoia, about how stress could affect judgment, and I realized she was rehearsing lines for the judge, building the case that I was no longer capable. My son avoided my eyes altogether, retreating into paperwork and long hours at the office, but I knew he was complicit in every decision, every erasure. I moved through those days like an actress learning lines for a role she will never perform, smiling when expected, nodding when required, but inside rehearsing another script, the one I would speak when the time finally came to stand in front of those who held power over my fate. And so the second escalation, though brutal, became also a crucible. The more they pressed, the harder I became. The more they tried to erase, the clearer I saw myself. The more they silenced me, the more words I gathered in secret, storing them for the day I would unleash them, not in anger, but in truth. They thought they were closing in around me, but what they were really doing was forging me into someone they would no longer recognize, someone who could not be pushed into a corner, someone who would stand, even if it broke every bone to do so. The past they tried to trap me in, of dependence, of silence, of crawling, was the very force that pushed me forward into a future where I would finally be my own. The day of the hearing arrived with the kind of heavy stillness that settles before a storm, a silence that is not peace, but the coiled anticipation of something about to break. And as I prepared myself that morning, buttoning a blouse whose fabric felt stiff against my fingers, I thought of all the nights I had stood in the dark rehearsing steps, all the whispers I had endured, all the humiliations I had swallowed like bitter medicine, and I told myself that every cruelty had been nothing more than the sharpening of my blade, that I had been tempered in fire and was ready now to strike. They expected me to enter that courtroom small and diminished, a trembling shadow in a wheelchair, the performance of helplessness that they had cultivated with such care. But I had decided otherwise. I had decided that if they wanted to put me on display, I would give them a spectacle they would never forget. When the car arrived to take us to the courthouse, my daughter-in-law fussed over me with exaggerated gentleness, adjusting the blanket on my lap as though I were fragile glass, and my son hovered behind her with the weary air of a man resigned to a burden. I let them play their roles, silent, watching, until we reached the steps of the courthouse where the lawyer I had contacted weeks before stood waiting, his suit sharp, his gaze steady. My children had not expected him. They assumed they alone would speak for me. The moment my son saw him, his face faltered, and for the first time in months, I felt the power tilt, if only slightly, back toward me. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and smelled faintly of paper and polish. I was seated at first in the chair they provided, the wheelchair they had insisted on bringing to complete the picture of frailty. But when the judge called my name, I rose, slowly, carefully, gripping the cane I had practiced with each night. I stood. The sound of the wooden chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back rang louder than any gavel. Gasps murmured through the room, even the judge pausing to watch, and my daughter-in-law's hand flew to her mouth in disbelief while my son stared as though seeing a ghost. I took a few steps forward, unsteady but upright, and in those steps I felt the weight of every humiliation I had endured lifting from me, replaced by something fierce and unyielding. The lawyer spoke first, laying out the case of coercion, of whispered commands, of missing documents, but when the time came for me to testify, I asked to speak directly. My voice at first quivered, not from fear but from the enormity of the moment, and then it steadied, growing clearer with each word. I told the court about the night they hid my wheelchair and whispered, "Crawl if you want to eat," how the words had sliced into me deeper than any wound, how the laughter that followed had hollowed me out. I described the dinners I was excluded from, the documents that vanished, the nights left in darkness, the pills counted out as though I were incapable of memory. I recounted the conversations overheard, the guardianship plans disguised as care, the erasure of my voice. The room grew quieter with each sentence, the judge leaning forward, the clerk's pen pausing over paper, even the lawyer for my son shifting uncomfortably in his seat. My daughter-in-law's face tightened, her painted lips pressed thin, and my son could not meet my eyes. I did not weep. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg. Instead, I spoke with a calm that cut sharper than rage, the calm of someone who has nothing left to lose but her dignity and has decided it will not be surrendered. I told them I was not confused, I was not senile, I was not incapable, and if my steps were slow, it did not mean my mind was absent. If my body wavered, it did not mean my will was gone. When I finished, the silence was absolute, the kind of silence that follows revelation. The judge cleared his throat and glanced at my children, their faces pale, their confidence fractured. The lawyer beside me placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement more than comfort. And in that touch, I felt the affirmation that I had done what I came to do. I had spoken, not whispered in my room, not muttered in the dark, not scribbled on scraps of paper to hide under my pillow, but spoken aloud, in public, under oath, with the weight of truth pressing each word into permanence. In that moment, I understood that whatever the outcome, I had already won, because they could never again pretend I was voiceless. They could never again present me as helpless. They could never again erase me with silence. My testimony had burned their performance to ash. And though the legal verdict was yet to be given, the moral one was already sealed. I had stood not only on my own feet but on the truth, and the truth once spoken cannot be forced back into silence. When the judgment was finally delivered in my favor, when the papers confirmed that guardianship would not be granted, when the house and pension and decisions of my life remained mine alone, there was no outburst of celebration, no dramatic raising of arms in triumph, only a slow unclenching within me, as though a fist that had been gripping my heart for years had at last begun to loosen its hold. My son and his wife left the courtroom in silence, their faces gray with defeat, and I watched them go, not with vengeance, but with a kind of weary clarity, understanding that whatever bond had once held us together had been permanently severed, that no legal ruling could restore the trust that had been broken, that some fractures in love once made do not heal but calcify into distance. I did not mourn them in that moment. I mourned the years before, the boy I had raised, the family I had believed I belonged to, the future I had imagined where my old age would be surrounded by warmth rather than suspicion. In the weeks that followed, I moved into a small apartment of my own, a modest place with creaking floors and thin walls. But it was mine, and in its imperfection, I found a strange beauty. I arranged the furniture slowly, not to please visitors, but to please myself, setting the chair by the window where the sun fell most generously, placing my books within reach, choosing curtains in a color that reminded me of wildflowers I once gathered as a girl. Each act of arrangement felt like a declaration. Here I decide, here I choose, here I live. The first meal I cooked for myself in that apartment was simple. Soup simmering on the stove, bread warming in the oven. But when I sat at the table and lifted the spoon to my mouth, tears blurred my vision. Not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of eating without humiliation, of eating not as a tolerated presence, but as a rightful occupant of my own life. I learned to love small rituals again. Morning tea in a chipped cup, steam curling into the quiet air, the sound of the radio murmuring news while I opened the window to let in the smell of rain, the evening light turning the buildings across the street to gold for a few fleeting minutes. These were not grand triumphs, not victories that would be recorded in any book, but they were mine, and they filled me with a serenity sharper than any revenge. Freedom, I discovered, is not loud but steady, not a shout but a breath taken without permission. At times, memories of that house still visited me. The laughter at dinners from which I was excluded, the cold tone of my daughter-in-law's voice, the silence of my son, but instead of wounding, those memories now served as reminders of what I had survived, proof of the distance between who I was then and who I had become. They had wanted me crawling, diminished, erased, but I had stood, and in standing I had reclaimed more than autonomy. I had reclaimed the right to be seen, the right to define myself, the right to live without apology. Sometimes in the evenings, when the world outside my window grows quiet and the shadows stretch long across the floor, I think of other women who might even now be sitting in rooms where their voices are dismissed, where their presence is tolerated but unwelcome, where whispers of control wear the mask of care. To them I would say, if they take your chair, find your feet, however unsteady. If they take your words, gather them in silence until the day you can release them like arrows. If they tell you to crawl, remember that dignity cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered, and you need not surrender it. I speak not as a heroine, but as an old woman who was underestimated, who was betrayed, who was pressed into corners until she discovered that corners can be foundations if you learn to push back. And so my story ends not with a return to the family I once had, but with the quiet creation of a life I can call my own. The apartment may be small, the nights at times lonely, the body slower than I would wish, but in each choice I make, in each step I take, there is the unshakable knowledge that I am no longer crawling toward a table where I am barely welcome, but standing at a table of my own, where no one whispers commands over me, where no one hides the chair that carries me, where the only voice that decides my worth is the one that has been inside me all along.